Alright, now it's recording. Okay. Alright, so what's our overall goal today? Well, what we're going to do is we're starting a completely new unit. Alright, and that new unit is about something that we call the good life. Alright, and the first text that we're doing when we look at the good life is we're gonna look at what's called the Gorgias. Now, the Gorgias is a pretty famous text, and it outlines through Socrates what Plato thought would be the best way to live. And I'll just read the overall goal. We're going to develop some historical and contextual knowledge needed to understand how Plato argues we should live a good life in his text Gorgias. Our three success criteria, which I don't expect you to fully understand at the moment, will be we're going to outline the historical and social context of this text. We're going to name and define new terms needed to understand the text, and then we're going to explore attitudes and beliefs that are reflected in these texts. So if you could quickly record them, these goals, and score yourself, and then I would like you to draw a picture for your APK that represents what you think living a good life would be like today. Alright? Remember you're on your... Hang on. What? Alright.
He has one.
Shh. Okay, write it down. I can stop. I'm recording now. Recording now. Alright. So, it's really good actually. We've just had 20 minutes of discussion and open questions, which is fantastic, which means the content is not being shoved down your throat. And that's actually a pretty good thing, because you have a time to process and kind of personalise the information. Now it's time for me to give you an introduction to the unit, alright? So, we've already asked the question, what is the good life? What does it mean to live the good life? And we've had a discussion about that. And these are discussions that were had 2,000 years ago by really rich ancient Greeks, okay? And let's face it, they were men, and they weren't slaves, and they probably weren't even workers or working class people back then, which had a different kind of title or status. They would have been really wealthy Greek men, alright? So when we look at the text, I mean, there's one thing we need to think about is, and we've been discussing it, you know, what is the nature of the good life and how can we live well? And this was a discussion that was first really considered by Plato through his book, which is called the Gorgias, okay? Now, many people have said that Aristotle asked these questions, the Buddha asked these questions, and, you know, from their perspective, you know, they've put in place certain texts and tried to, in the past, create kind of an understanding as to how you would live this life. And those kind of understandings in the past that we've generated have kind of filtered through and they've acquired different meanings now in modern society, okay? So we really do have to ask the questions that we've been asking. So, like, when we think about the good life, are we thinking about happiness? Are we thinking about, you know, what is human nature? Does human nature have a particular way of functioning? Does it have a particular way of being? And we need to kind of live in line with that. Or is the good life really about preparing ourselves for death? Okay? These are some key questions that a lot of philosophers were contemplating when we look at Plato's Gorgias. Okay? Fist of 5, how well have you understood everything that I'm talking about so far? All the way up, so I get a sense of whether or not I'm making sense.
Good.
Alright. Yes, mate, ask the question.
You have to pick one thing. So let's say just one thing you had in your life. What would it be?
The children. Okay, so
Anthony, come on.
it would probably go family and then philosophy or politics. Because there's something really spiritual about being able to contemplate how the world works, and philosophy in general. Alright, so let's look at a timeline and a bit of a philosophical context, alright? So the way that we can understand this book is by looking at education and understanding how education was put in place in ancient Greek society, right? there would have, first things we need to understand is that you only really got an education and a proper education if you were a young, rich son, okay? Women were literally, they were educated, they might have been taught how to read and write, but they weren't educated in terms of the arts of rhetoric, philosophy, sophistry, things like that, arithmetic, no. And of course, if you were poor, or a working class boy, no chance whatsoever, you just couldn't afford to pay for it. So this was really, the education in terms of its real in-depth study was something that was made available to rich young boys, all right? Take a moment to write something down, please. Am I able to move on, or do you need more time? Okay. So primarily what happened was this education really took place in public schools or private tutors. Now, if you were really, really rich, you would probably get a private tutor, all right? And if you were rich but not mega wealthy, then you'd go to a public school. But a public school wasn't like what we think it is today in Australia, where the taxpayer pays for the school and we as a taxpayer consume it that way. It was basically just a school that was open to the public and you could apply for entry, but you still had to pay really high fees, right? Now, when you went to these public schools, you learned all the basic literacy skills, which was reading, writing, and you learned all the basic numeracy skills, right? Arithmetic, geometry, and stuff like that. And as you progressed, you were taught the texts that really were like the texts that were reflected on to have an understanding of what it meant to be Greek, okay? And those texts were composed by Homer, and they are the Iliad and the Odyssey, all right? Or if you want, you've all probably seen Troy, but the Iliad is the story of the Battle of Troy, the Greeks versus the Trojans, and then the Odyssey is the story about Ulysses or Odysseus trying to make it back, all right? So take some notes quickly, but how does everyone understand what I've been talking about so far? That basically, as a young boy, you were taught how to read, write, and numeracy, and then when you got to a certain sufficient level, you were then expected to read the Iliad and read the Odyssey and other texts, but mainly those two texts, to kind of get a sense of what, basically what virtue and wisdom looked like from the Greek tradition. That's why I've got Gandalf.
So once you reach a certain academic level, you learn.
All right, so this kind of.
No, he wasn't black.
Did you not know that?
What?
Okay, can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? I'm recording. All right, so this kind of education where you reflected on the classics had a basic level of numeracy. It was expected to finish around about 14, and from there you'd move on to what was effectively secondary school. But that was really, really advanced stuff. That was when you started learning the tough stuff. Now you got two options. You could go to a permanent school, and that would basically consist of you using these wax tablets and recording and basically absorbing everything your tutor would teach you. And again, that is something you would do if you were not rich, not mega rich, but rich, okay? But if you were mega rich, you would employ one of these guys, a sophist, all right? And a sophist was somebody who would come to your house and tutor you, all right? And exactly. Oh, you see the relationship? Great. That's why. No, not now. It's because they should have paid their tax. Anyway, shh. But basically, the idea was that you would employ a sophist to basically come to your house, reside in your house. So you'd be a patron who would pay them to come and live at your house. They would cost a lot of money, and they would teach your son knowledge. Right, so you would learn lots of stuff in general. You'd also learn about the art of public speaking, right? Because it was considered really important, especially in a Athenian democracy, to be able to speak in public. That was how you politically manoeuvred, right? You had to be a good public speaker to have any power. And the last thing that you learnt was called rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is a bit confusing, so I'm giving you two definitions. One is a definition of a sophist, and the other is a definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is what we would call persuasive language and persuasive devices. It's teaching people how to persuade. It's not teaching people to argue logic. It's teaching people how to persuade. So the sophist was a private tutor that was employed by the mega rich, and they were asked to come and teach a son about knowledge and facts and information, everything they could, but also the art of public speaking and also rhetoric. Take a note. Rhetoric is... So time to work towards near the end. Now, the thing is that with the sophists, and this is pretty easy to see, they were loved by the mega rich. All right? Like, the mega rich, the filthy, like, I can buy my own little private island and then turn it into a ship and sail it across the world. The mega rich loved the sophists because they taught their kids how to maintain power, right? Through the use of public speaking and rhetoric. They were kind of, especially near the end of like near the decline of ancient Greek civilization, they were kind of despised by the people, right? Now the reason why they were despised is because they were thought of as basically selling their soul. Obviously, here's a man selling his soul, doing a devil's handshake, right? And the reason for that was because they would basically, they'd have brains, they'd have knowledge, but remember, their job was to teach the sons of the mega rich and how to use rhetoric and public speaking and knowledge to maintain power and to maintain wealth. Now you can imagine that would only basically mean that all your knowledge and stuff like that, you can't pursue truth, you can't be true to your word. You have to do whatever's going to keep the wealthy wealthy. You have to teach that. Does that make sense? So they were kind of like despised by the people who couldn't afford them. Now from their perspective too, they were skeptics, and people didn't like that because people were thinking that the way to be true and pure is to believe in our institutions and believe in the way society works. But the sophists were thought of as skeptics who wanted to reject that and just keep the powerful in charge, so the powerful could run over those institutions. They were thought of as atheists or agnostics, alright? So they rejected pretty much a lot of the teachings of the religions and taught only what you needed to maintain power. That got people really, really angry, right? Their sole goal, right, was to teach children how to be powerful in an assembly and how to use public speaking and persuasion in an assembly. Call that rhetoric from now on. And it was also to teach them how to use power and persuasion in a court of law so they could maintain their wealth and defend themselves in those environments. So they really were not liked at all. In fact, they caused a lot of arguments, all right? And they were kind of seen as something that allowed the mega rich to climb up and to maintain power and be mega rich. But from the point of view of philosophers like Plato or Aristotle here's Plato, not liked. And there's a reason for that. So take some notes, just some notes about things that I've said. See, philosophers like Socrates, Plato and Aristotle tended to think that sophists were the living embodiment, like what they practiced in their lives, of deception, which meant that any kind of intellectual inquiry or any kind of attempt to know the real world. So do you remember, like, it was Plato who pursued that idea of the world of ideal forms? You get to know the true understanding of what the world is through, intellectual reflection and understanding the idea in and of itself. Do you remember that stuff that we studied with Phaedo? Yeah, well, to him, these guys, these sophists, they're getting in the way of that because they're not teaching people about ideal forms. They're just teaching people about how to have power, right? So sophists, according to Plato, Aristotle and Socrates, are different from philosophers. The sophist is the living embodiment of deception, whereas the philosopher is the living embodiment of somebody who wants to pursue truth and knowledge. Okay? And that's one major assumption that underlines the text that we're going to start reading. There's a divide between sophists and philosophers. Okay, sophists are about deception and living deception because they teach people how to maintain power. They're not solely focused on knowledge in and of itself, whereas the philosopher wants to know truth and knowledge in and of itself. It wants to know the pure, real thing. Okay? And that's it.